All right, we're back. Thank you so much for that, hanging out. This is really fun for me. I've been kind of waiting for this. We talked about this a year ago, and the old upside down world that we've lived in prevented us. So it's great to have this finally come around. Our presenter tonight, Dr. Heather Branstetter, and she's from Silver Valley originally, graduated summa cum laude from the University of Idaho before going on to earn a PhD in rhetoric and cultural studies from the University of North Carolina in 2012. Her academic research article discussing the more notorious aspects of her hometown won the Charles Nepper Award for the most significant contributions to scholastic in scholarship in rhetoric in 2017. Dr. Branstetter has been a member of the Wallace City Council since 2016, serves on the board of the Bernard Stockbridge Museum up there as program director, and is the executive director of the Historic Wallace Preservation Society. If you haven't read her book, go out and get it. You can come down and get it at the library. It's a fascinating book, and I brought my copy to get personally autographed. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Heather Branstetter. This is going to be a fun program. Here we go.
So thanks so much to the Museum of North Idaho for inviting me. We were supposed to do this last year, but then of course COVID happened, so we're being flexible, and it's such an honor to be here. Museums do so much for historians, and I found this out firsthand when I went to write my book. I checked in with the Mining Museum in Wallace, and they greatly helped my whole project. And if it weren't for them, we probably wouldn't have the book that we have today. And so I really appreciate museums. It's so important for us to be able to preserve our history. As you all know, probably anyway, Northern Idaho's had a huge influx of people, newcomers. As you saw earlier in the meeting tonight, everyone was touting their homegrown credentials, more important than PhDs. And part of that reason is because we have a culture and a history that is so important to preserve, and that was a big reason. One of the main drivers of wanting to write the book was to preserve this very unique aspect of Wallace's history that a lot of people know about, but probably won't know about in the next generation. In fact, some of the knowledge had already been lost by the time that I went to do the research. I had not heard of Dolores Arnold before I started doing this research, and yet she was the most famous madam in Wallace. And part of that was just, I was very young when this all ended, and now this generation that's growing up now didn't have any of this knowledge at all, because of course the FBI raid came along in 1991 and kind of put the final nail in the coffin of sex work in Wallace. So I designed the book to take place in 3 parts. The first part is kind of an introduction or an overview with a lot of the primary source materials. I used master's theses. I used oral histories that other people had done. I read a bunch of books. I also did primary source archival work in various special collections, and also museums and people's basements. And I was so happy to hear that you'll have a fireproof archival room. That's exciting. We lose things into fire all the time when they're just hanging out in people's houses and they catch on fire. So it's great to have some better preservation available. And then part 2, I kind of give my take on why sex work lasted for so long in the Silver Valley, and of course in Wallace in particular. And I cover the reasons also a little bit in this documentary, so I'll try not to spoiler any of it. And then part 3 were oral histories. I did 99 oral histories, and since then I've continued to do more that made it into the book, at least. And I wanted these oral histories to really speak for themselves, so I didn't offer the reader much guidance. I wanted people to kind of get a feel for how the cadence of storytelling in the Silver Valley, which is unique. Northern Idaho, I think even in the West, you can probably make generalizations about how people tell stories. And so I wanted to capture that. Also, the older generation tells stories differently from the younger generations as well. So, so those kind of speak for themselves, and you'll hopefully hear some of that in this documentary as well. It was directed by Delaney Buffett. She found out about us through Atlas Obscura, and she discovered us through Wallace, through the Oasis Bordella Museum article on Atlas Obscura. And sadly, the Oasis Bordella Museum is undergoing transition, and they may not reopen unless somebody kind of like comes along and maybe has some deep pockets to save it somehow. So again, that's why it's so important to preserve local history. You never know when it's gonna not be able to be funded. So if you haven't done so already, go ahead and click donate on the Museum of North Idaho's homepage and keep them alive and thriving, and subscribe to their YouTube video service as well. Okay, so thank you for tuning in. As you can see, we tried to show kind of like an even-handed presentation. It's really hard actually to find people who will speak against sex work. One of our comments said, what did the churches say about it? They are generally the other negative voice that people would discuss, but even then they did seem to be okay with it, because basically even when people were members of the church and also influential in town politics, they did not choose to get rid of the sex work, because the city leaders, the mayor, they all knew that if they tried to end it, that then they would just elect people who would bring it back. So the town had enough of a majority that was in favor of it that there was just no political will for doing anything else about it. And since Northern Idaho was so powerful in state politics at that time, because of the amount of money that we had from silver, there wasn't really anything to tip the balance against it at the broader level either, for a really, really long time. So when they say the economy affected it, it affected it in multiple ways. So I guess I would like to open it up for questions from board members, if they are interested in asking them. Right, yeah, so this is kind of a process question, as well as what the differences were between the book research and the documentary research. So what we ended up doing was I recorded oral histories for most everyone who I talked to for my book research. And then when Delaney came in, and she and I and Jocelyn Foyles, who runs the Lux Rooms, which is also a former brothel that now you can go stay in. It's been, they preserved some of it actually, and the remodel happened before Jocelyn and Matthias took over. But so she helped a lot as well, because I was also working a job at the time. And we just kind of did a whirlwind filming for, I think it was 3 days in total. And we talked to a lot of the people who I talked to for the book, but then we also talked to a few other people. There was one woman who told me something that who told us something that she had never told me individually. And she also didn't do it on camera for the documentary, of course, because as anyone knows, a lot of the best stuff happens before and after, the recording is rolling. And she was talking about how she paid for her future husband to go up and lose his virginity in the houses, because they both figured that somebody needed to know what they were doing up there. And we were like, oh wow, you should have said that on camera, let's bring it back. And she's like, nope. So let's see, Dave Albertini I talked to, he was the one who was saying that he went up there every Friday night after the football game. I believe he's still working at the Hilltop restaurant over in Kingston. If you guys want to go to dinner there, you can hear some of his stories. I think he lives around here, actually. So he told some different stories. So we did get to hear some new material, new content for the documentary as opposed to the book. But a lot of it was also overlapping. I knew Holly was the woman who kind of told her more personal story. I knew from talking with her earlier that she'd had a negative experience with it. And I suspected that she might be willing to share it because even some people who had negative experiences were not as willing to share on screen either. And I kind of had to talk her into it a little bit. So it took a lot of bravery, I think, for her to kind of get on and share that other perspective with us. But of course, it's really important to have that present, even if it was a more minority viewpoint.
My question is, I heard that the madams didn't always take cash, that sometimes they were taking like stock and shares in the mines and other forms of payment.
Yeah. So I didn't hear about the stock, but I would not be surprised if that happened. I did hear that the madams would take diamond drill bits as payment. Of course, the miners drill with using real diamonds in their drill bits, and so it was rumored that the madams did accept that as payment. The mine owners were, of course, not super happy about that, so I don't think that was very common either. But I did hear that happened.
Another person wants to know how long the FBI was involved. Was it a raid and a leave, or were they did they stick around for a while?
Yeah. So it's surprising to me actually that the more recent part of the history was for me, some of the more difficult details to sort through the truth and the falsehood. It seems like the further back in history you get, kind of the more secure narrative that you find. But the more recent stuff was a little trickier. I did a FOIA request to gain access to the documents from the FBI about the raid. There's so many that they were like, well, it's going to take some years to do this. So we suggest you do it's like a medium length request, which was up to 1,000 pages. And that took a year and a half to receive. So none of that material made it into this book. And hopefully it will make it into a forthcoming book. But that material features the prosecutorial report from a 2-year long undercover investigation. It might have been even longer. I haven't completely finished going through all of it, as you might imagine. And a lot of it is also heavily redacted. But they arrived around the time that the women from the Oasis left. So the story that the Oasis tells is that the women figured out that there were undercover FBI agents here in town, or there was some scuffle that happened within the sheriff's department here locally, and then they came over to the FBI office here in Coeur d'Alene, or perhaps Spokane, depending on who's telling the story. And then also, hopefully I'll have these details sorted out by the next book. But what happened was they got wind of this undercover investigation. Other people say nobody had any idea that the raid was happening. So I can't really sort through, where the truth is on that. But it does seem kind of strangely coincidental that that house shut down around that time. And then Dolores owned 2 houses, and she became ill. I think she came down with Alzheimer's around that same time, 86 or so. The Oasis shut down in 88. I want to say that Dolores was around 87. And then the UNI continued to run, as Christy said, up until 2 weeks before the raid happened. So the raid happened in June 23rd of 1991, and they left around the time, the very beginning of June. And people also say that well, one woman in particular said that one of the guys had mentioned that he'd tipped off one of the girls, or one of the girls had mentioned to her that she'd been tipped off by one of the guys that a raid was going to happen, and that they must have kept it very quiet to themselves, because it was, I mean, according to most accounts, a surprise when all the agents came over the hill and in force. And Dick Caron, he gets it mostly right. It was the biggest raid in the history of the whole Rocky Mountain region. So yeah, it was called overkill quite a bit in the papers. And of course, the FBI wasn't on everyone's top 5 list at that time after Waco and Ruby Ridge. So it was around that time.
There's 2 questions about the Wallace police involvement, if they'd ever raided separately, and then another person suggesting that the former sheriff's deputy was participating with the FBI in the raid as a retaliation. So I know those are 2 separate questions, but
yeah. So I spoke with the lawyer who represented Sheriff Sinkovich in the trial, and he made it out like Sinkovich was simply doing what people expected him to do as an elected official, and that he was trying to do it as best he could, and that their argument, which was a successful one in court, was that, you can't come in and prosecute one man and try to convict one man for something that's been deeply embedded in the culture of a town and a community for over 100 years. And of course, the sex workers were not the main target of the FBI raid. The gambling was, and then the sheriff was. And then in order to get him under the RICO Act, they had to have 2 different kinds of corruption under the law. And so they had to prove that there was corruption both on gambling and something else. And they were looking for either drugs or sex work. And so that was why they kind of involved the sex workers in it, where they weren't really the main target. And yeah, supposedly this all came about because one of the sheriff's deputies was known to have cooperated with the FBI. They called him Wireman Shireman. Yeah, and he's of course redacted from the official prosecutorial report, but you can kind of figure out him, and also Merrill Field. They called him Squirrely Murley. So lots of great nicknames, because a lot of people were really bitter and upset about this, right? This is people's livelihoods. But when I talked with Merrill before he passed, he told me, he lost $200,000. It was, devastating to him, personally. It wasn't a good deal for him either. It's not like he was gaining anything. It sounds like he was kind of just trying to make the best decisions that he could make too. So yeah, the raid is a very contentious, I think, subject that probably difficult to deal with in a quick question and answer session. But hopefully, I mean, maybe people write in, tell us your stories, tell me your stories, give me an email, and let's hear more perspectives. Yeah, so he's asking that if some of the pictures were mugshots of the girls, and that's right. In fact, that was a huge find, and that was brought to me by then Sheriff Mitch Alexander, and he had all these files in his basement that looked like that. And I could probably share a little bit here. There's some more that I have on my computer, but you can go through and see their rap sheets on there. Let me go ahead and pull that up if I can. Let me do a share screen. Each of the women had to be registered with the sheriff's department, and then they did an FBI background check on every single woman from, and we have records as a result of Mitch Alexander's donation, which they're now kept in the mining museum, but I digitized all of them. We now have records from beginning around 1952 and going all the way up until 1973, which was when there was a change in FBI policy. And so then the sheriff's department stopped keeping keeping the records. So they start with Wallace Police Department, and then when Wallace moved to Shoshone County Sheriff's, they went to there. And apparently Sheriff Sinkovich had kept these, and just kind of out of a desire to preserve the history, I think. And I mean, because it's an amazing collection for researchers, because we don't have this kind of information on sex workers anywhere, really. It's very significant. And so what he ended up doing, Mitch ended up finding them because Sheriff Sinkovich's wife had saved them as well. And after Sheriff Sinkovich died, and then because she couldn't bear to let them go or burn them, which was what apparently Sinkovich wanted her to do. And so then she gave them to Mitch, to the Sheriff's Department, and then he brought them to the Mining Museum. And what's really cool is you can also see other towns that were on the circuit, the so-called circuit. So Wallace was not alone at that time in regulating prostitution. Part of what made Wallace unusual is that it lasted so long, but up until the 50s, even into the 60s in a few places, other towns were also kind of doing a similar thing. So you can see, in Cle Elum, Washington, which was also a mining town, they did the charge reads INV, and that just simply means investigation. And it means they just, fingerprinted and mugged them and released them. Seattle, Washington, you can see that they were actually kind of prosecuted. In LA, they were listed as transient or vagrant. In Burley is also another code word, often for sex work. And so you can see all these different towns, which were, mining towns, logging towns. Troy, Montana was on earlier screen. So you can go through and kind of track where the circuit was. There was organized crime out of Great Falls. And so a lot of women had ended up into the profession through organized crime. In Wallace, you did not have to have a sponsor as from organized crime in any way. You didn't have to have a pimp as a sponsor. But in a lot of other towns, that was kind of how it worked. So Wallace was actually freer for the women to work, although I'm sure it still, had a lot of problems. We can read about some of those in this. There's another interview here with a woman who talks at length about being cooped up in the house all the time. They weren't supposed to solicit on the streets. That was basically to kind of have a distinction between polite society and sex work, because it's such a small town. It was quite downtown where the location was. But so they had rules, and those rules are kind of covered in, this is a great little article. Diane Simmons wrote it. She emailed me and talked to me about how young and naive she was at the time of writing this, but it must have been quite a pleasure to talk with Dolores, who had this amazing sense of humor. She saw the examination before as a social service, where they're looking for VD, what they called VD back then, rather. And Dolores said, they get paid for doing for men what other women do on the surface, at least, for free. So who's exploiting whom? There's the idea that, and we heard this in the film, that women would be raped, or, sex workers were necessary to protect the safety and virtue of other women. And this one is great. Former Mayor Keller says, he starts out by saying, with the belligerence of a man who has had to defend his position many times, if you can't wipe it out, you're smarter to regulate it. It goes under the name massage parlor in other cities. And I love this line: girls who can't meet Wallace's standards go to Boise or Spokane to work. And there was often this setup distinguishing, you know, how sex work worked in Wallace from other places. Southern Idaho gets brought up quite a bit, you know, with the moralizing that happens in the Mormon South, you know. So Robert's bringing up this notion of, they call it the volcano theory of men's sexuality, that it's gotta go somewhere. Absolutely. And some of the best archives that I found were these forms that got distributed to soldiers and sailors during World War I, because this was seen as a huge problem for our military preparedness before we had penicillin, right? Like, you know, syphilis and gonorrhea were like real big problems before that. And so they ran these public health campaigns, you know, warning soldiers about you know, venereal disease, as they called it at the time. And they, you know, kind of likened towns like Wallace to some kind of like cesspool of disease. And, you know, it's funny, like, it's strange now that we're, you know, kind of in a time where we've all gone through a public health crisis. That was very much the case also 100 years ago with sex work as well. And it's kind of hard to keep that perspective in mind because, you know, we do have penicillin now. But that was definitely a big concern, and what shut down most of the red light districts as well, besides Wallace. Here's the menu that you're referring to, Robert. So straight, no frills. This is from the Oasis Museum. Half and half, you might be able to figure out, was oral sex and then traditional sex. Straight French, that was how they referred to oral sex, because the French were so scandalous with their oral sex practices. And then it goes on down to the bubble bath, the much lauded bubble bath, which if you had a bubble bath, people remembered that. I was talking to Terry Douglas, who he was very private about what happened during the bubble bath, but it was an event to remember.
That actually kind of leads into a question about what happened to the community when the houses shut down because they were so generous. You know, what happened to the band now, and social programs and other activities that they sponsored.
Right. Yeah. So Robert was talking about how lucrative the industry was for the town of Wallace, and how it really impacted us when it ended. You know, I feel like, so we've had problems with our city pool for the last 3 years or so. And I believe that if the Madams had been around still right now, that we would have had kids swimming right away, you know, but instead it took a little longer. But, you know, Wallace people still, they come around. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the mining riches actually, you know, kind of went to these foundations that are now based out of Spokane. And some of it's coming back to the community in the form of scholarships and community donations. But like Innovia, I think. But, you know, it would be nice if we had some of those resources available now that we used to.
And there's a question about how receptive outside of Idaho that the documentary film has been.
Oh yeah. You know what? We've played it for packed houses who just, I mean, they just loved it for the most part. I think we've only had maybe like one audience had some negative reaction. When was this? I think it was in Crested Butte, Colorado, which is similar to, you know, Northern Idaho in some ways. But a lot of that, I think, a lot of the negative response, I think, comes from the raised awareness that people now have of the problem of sex trafficking. And a lot of people confuse sex work with sex trafficking. Of course, you know, back then, there were not as many opportunities for women. And so a lot of them did end up in the profession because they didn't have other options. One woman, was talking about how she had kids. And so, she had to find a way to take care of them. She wasn't a fast typer. People, just didn't hire women as much for as varied positions. And they expected that they were, going to have a paycheck from the husband that was providing most of the income for the family. But if a woman didn't have a husband, then things were very difficult monetary, and then they could just make a whole bunch of money. And so that was how a lot of them ended up in it. But nowadays there's more options, but still some women are choosing to be call girls and sex workers. I talked to a woman who works out of Seattle, and she was visiting a gentleman in Sandpoint at that time, and she was saying how much she enjoys it. If you have to do a job, she liked the job. So there's all sorts. But yeah, for the most part, everyone has been pretty receptive. So yeah.
Oh, we got one more in the audience.
Okay, so she's asked if my research came across any illegitimate children from the ladies. Yes, legitimate, and I talked about legitimate children and illegitimate children, or a story about a man who apparently grew up with a sister in the same school that he didn't even know was his sister, and it didn't come out until later that his dad had kind of, had another dalliance result, I guess. And I think, I don't know if he even ever met that person to this day, or if he just found out about it later. I can't remember exactly. I didn't include it in the book, but we did have a conversation about that. And I know that it definitely impacted the kids, even if they were sheltered to some extent. So that is certainly, something. I mean, it is definitely an unfortunate reality of the business, and I think one that's unavoidable. That it impacts the kids in some ways. On the other hand, Ms. Kuntz, who you heard in the documentary, so one of the girls who I went to school with, she was a granddaughter of the madam of the UNI rooms, and she brought the kids in to register them for school. She was taking care of them instead of mom, who was, not available to. And Kathy, Mrs. Kuntz asked her if she, needed free reduced lunch. And she goes, you don't know who I am, do you? And she flashed. And then all of a sudden, Kathy saw all these rings on her fingers, and she was like, I am quite capable. It was insulting to her that she wouldn't be able to provide for the grandkids. And so there's kind of different sides of the coin, even if the kids weren't with their mom, at least she was able to provide for them. Let's see. I see one that says backlash after the complete shutdown. There was a lot of backlash. So if you read some newspaper articles at the time, you can see how much people were very resentful of the federal government trying to come in and tell us what to do. Some of which, you can hear these cultural strands still to this day. And which is, again, one of the awesome things about history is we can better understand the present and make our future a better place. So I think that's all I've got.
Yep, that's all you got. So
Thank you.